So I'm talking to this guy about the Sabbath and the kosher food laws, and he's trying to convince me that as a follower of Jesus, I need to be keeping these things. And I just stopped and asked him, hold on, are you Jewish? And he paused and with a confused look on his face and said, no, why does that matter? And I said, well, those laws were only given to ancient Israel, so they only apply to the Jewish people. And of course, he disagreed strongly with me. So we went back and forth for a bit, and it was a friendly discussion, but he was basically arguing that when a foreigner lived among the Israelites, they were required to live under the law of Moses. So in his mind, that meant that the law was given to Gentiles as well. And he said, dude, or maybe he said bro, I can't remember, but he said, do me a favor, read Exodus 12:49. So I pulled out my phone, and I think he was a little surprised that I was actually going to read it right at that moment. And I pulled up that verse and I read it out loud. The same law shall apply to the native as to the stranger who sojourns among you. And he had this kind of triumphant look on his face. So I said to him, did you know that Jesus demanded that his enemies be slaughtered right in front of him? And he was like, what? Yeshua never said that. He told us to love our enemies. So I said, read Luke 19:27. So he pulls out his phone and reads that verse out loud. But as for these enemies of mine who did not want me to reign over them, bring them here and slaughter them before me. And I said, those words are in red, aren't they? Jesus said that. And he's like, yeah, but, and he starts scrolling up to read the verses before it to try to understand the passage it was in. Now he knew it didn't sound right, and what he was looking for was the context of that verse. So he instinctively knew that context matters, but for whatever reason, and this was my point to him, he hadn't looked at the context of Exodus 12:49, the verse that he had quoted to me about the same law. So that's what I want to do with you today. Not only with that verse, but with two other similar verses in the Torah that are just as commonly quoted by our Hebrew roots friends when trying to argue that God gave the law of Moses to the Gentiles. And my hope is that this will help us respond more biblically the next time a Torah keeper cites these verses to argue this issue. Okay, so let's see what this verse in Exodus 12 is all about. It's found within the larger passage that runs from verse 43 through 51, which records the institution of Passover. Now the passage begins in verse 43 saying, and the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, this is the statute of the Passover. No foreigner shall eat of it. So right off the bat, we find a pretty significant distinction between the native-born Israelites and foreigners. Now, as we'll see, Yahweh does allow a provision for non-Jews who want to keep the Passover later in this passage, but we don't want to miss the fact that Yahweh makes a very clear distinction between foreigners and his people, the Israelites, when issuing commands. And that's a pattern we see all throughout the Torah. So this passage goes on to list God's rules for the Passover, right? Slaves who have been circumcised can keep it. Foreigners or hired workers may not eat of it. Needs to be eaten in one house. Shall not break any of its bones. And then verse 47 says, all the congregation of Israel shall keep it. So the Passover meal is a command specifically for Israel, and it applies to every Israelite. And God didn't give them a choice. He says, the congregation of Israel shall keep it. That's a command. And then in verse 48, God provides an opportunity for strangers who are traveling with Israel. If a stranger shall sojourn with you and would keep the Passover to the Lord. Now notice that it's not required of all sojourners the way it was commanded of all Israelites. It says, if a stranger would keep the Passover. In other words, it's permitted, but it's not required. So for those strangers who choose to keep the Passover, God says, let all his males be circumcised, then he may come near and keep it. He shall be as a native of the land. Or some translations say, he may take part like one born in the land. But no uncircumcised person shall eat of it. So God allowed Gentiles in Israel to participate in the Passover meal under one condition. They needed to first show their allegiance to Yahweh by being circumcised. So we're seeing a clear distinction here between the native-born Israelites, the Jewish people, and everyone else, right? Yahweh isn't looking at Israel as a mixed multitude gathered together in Egypt getting ready for the big Exodus. No, Israel is to be a holy nation for him. They're set apart from all the other nations, from the Gentiles. And that distinction is very clear in this passage. I mean, this is all about how to eat the Passover meal and who can partake of it. And God makes distinctions between people groups here. And then we get to the verse that my friend wanted me to read, verse 49. There shall be one law for the native and for the stranger who sojourns among you. So this one law that applies to the native and the stranger isn't a reference to the law of Moses. In fact, the law of Moses hadn't even been given yet. Israel was still in Egypt when God gave them these Passover commands. So verse 49 isn't talking about the Mosaic law, but rather about God's specific command that everyone who participates in the Passover meal must be circumcised. That is the law that applies to both the Israelites and the strangers who sojourns among them. Here's another passage that I hear a lot from my Torah-keeping friends when trying to convince me that the law of Moses applied equally to Israel and the Gentiles among them. Leviticus 24:22 says, There shall be one standard for you. It shall be for the stranger as well as the native, for I am the Lord your God. And here we have the exact same scenario we just saw in Exodus 12. So when taken on its own, this verse sounds like a slam dunk. But when you read it in context, the Hebrew root's argument evaporates. So this verse is found in a passage that runs from verses 17 through 22, which is a discussion about the civil penalties in ancient Israel. Now, some translations put a heading over this section of an eye for an eye. And interestingly, these 6 verses are actually tucked in the middle of a story about a man who had cursed the name of the Lord. And that larger story reveals something pretty relevant to our discussion. So, let's back up to verse 10 and read the story. Now an Israelite woman's son, whose father was an Egyptian, went out among the people of Israel. Okay, so this was a sort of mixed race man, right? He had an Israelite mother and an Egyptian or Gentile father. And the Israelite woman's son and a man of Israel fought in the camp. And the Israelite woman's son blasphemed the name and cursed. And the phrase here, the name, in Hebrew is Hashem, which is a reference to God himself. So this half-Gentile man got in a fight with an Israelite. During that fight, the half-Gentile man blasphemed God and cursed his name. Then they brought him to Moses. His mother's name was Shlomith, the daughter of Divri, the tribe of Dan. But they put him in custody till the will of the Lord should be clear to them. So this story really gives us the sense of Israel as a brand new nation, fresh out of slavery, trying to figure out how to handle these situations. I mean, if it was a full-blooded Israelite who blasphemed and cursed the God of Israel, they would have known what to do. Blasphemy was specifically prohibited in Exodus 22:28, and the penalty was death. But because this guy was only half Israelite, they needed to ask the Lord, how should this be handled? Which again underscores the fact that the Israelites were set apart from, they were distinct from all the other nations in God's eyes. This is why they needed direction here. They knew the death penalty for blasphemy applied to Israelites, but what if someone's only half Israelite? So they took it to Yahweh, verse 13. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Bring out of the camp the one who cursed, and let all who heard him lay their hands on his head, and let all the congregation stone him. And speak to the people of Israel, saying, Whoever curses his God shall bear his sin. Whoever blasphemes the name of the Lord shall surely be put to death. All the congregation shall stone him. And listen to this. The sojourner, as well as the native, when he blasphemes the name, shall be put to death. So God gave Israel his decree, right? And in this decree, we again see a distinction between the sojourner and the native. And the blaspheming of the holy living God, both are subject to the same penalty for this offense. And now we get to our eye for an eye passage, okay, verse 17. Whoever takes a human life shall surely be put to death. So it's the death penalty for murder. Whoever takes an animal's life shall make it good, life for life. So it's a lesser penalty of restitution for killing an animal. If anyone injures his neighbor, as he has done, it shall be done to him. fracture for fracture, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. Whatever injury he's given a person shall be given to him. Whoever kills an animal shall make it good, and whoever kills a person shall be put to death. Okay, what these verses are establishing for Israel is a legal principle of appropriate retaliation, right? Yahweh says that the punishment must be commensurate with the crime. For example, if someone steps on your foot, you can't cut off his foot. And if he kills your sheep, you can't murder his family, right? The punishment has to fit the crime. And by the way, this is a sobering reminder of how holy and exalted the living God is, because the appropriate punishment for blaspheming and cursing him is death. And that brings us to the verse that our Hebrew roots friends try to use as a proof text, verse 22. You shall have the same rule for the sojourner and for the native, for I am the Lord your God. And now we can rightly understand this verse because we have the context for it. So the same rule Yahweh is speaking of here isn't the entirety of the Mosaic law, it's the standard of appropriate retaliation. So on this issue, in response to the Israelites asking God, hey, you told us what the punishment is for an Israelite, but what about someone who's only half Israelite? And God's answer was that the same rules of punishment apply to the sojourner and the native. And that becomes obvious when we read verses 21 through 23 together. Whoever kills an animal shall make it good, and whoever kills a person shall be put to death. You shall have the same rule for the sojourner and for the native, for I am the Lord your God. So there was God's answer about the standard of punishment for crimes, and then, so Moses spoke to the people of Israel, and they brought out of the camp the one who had cursed, the half-Israelite, and stoned him with stones. Thus the people of Israel did as the Lord commanded Moses. As much as I love my Hebrew roots friends, I have to admit that sometimes talking with them feels like that movie Groundhog Day, where Bill Murray has to keep living the same exact day over and over again until he gets it right. And many Torah keepers just keep repeating the same arguments over and over again, and I suppose they're going to keep doing so until they finally get it right and realize that because of the life and death and resurrection of Jesus, Christians aren't required to keep the law of Moses. Now, the same scenario we just saw in Exodus 12 and Leviticus 24 is repeated in Numbers 15. The text that our Torah-keeping friends point to is verse 16, which says, "One law and one rule shall be for you and the stranger who sojourns with you." Now, when you quote it by itself, this verse seems to support the Hebrew roots position, doesn't it? But let's shine the light of context on it and see what we have here. Verse 16 is found in a longer passage that actually runs from verses 1 through 21, where the Lord is giving Moses the laws about supplementary offerings. Now, we don't need to read through the entire passage, but let's look at the first couple verses to get our bearings. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the people of Israel and say to them, when you come into the land you are to inhabit, which I am giving you, and you offer to the Lord from the herd or from the flock, the food offering or a burnt offering or a sacrifice, to fulfill a vow or as a freewill offering or at your appointed feasts to make a pleasing aroma to the Lord, then he who brings his offering shall," and then the text goes on to describe all types of scenarios for offerings and sacrifices. So this is God, through Moses, preparing the Israelites for the proper way to make supplementary offerings to him once they enter the promised land. And the text talks about how to offer flour mixed with oil for a burnt offering and wine for drink offerings and different types of animals for the sacrifices. And then verse 13 says, "Every native Israelite shall do these things in this way in offering a food offering with a pleasing aroma to the Lord." So every Israelite is required to make these offerings. Again, it's a command. Every native Israelite shall do these things in this way. Verse 14. "And if a stranger is sojourning with you, or anyone is living permanently among you, and he wishes to offering a food offering," now, notice that for strangers and sojourners, making these offerings is optional, not required. God says, if he wishes to offer a food offering with a pleasing aroma to the Lord, he shall do as you do. So strangers and sojourners who choose to make offerings have to do so in the same way that native Israelites do it. That's really interesting. So the offerings and how they're made and what's offered is identical between the Israelite and the Gentile. And for the Israelite, the offering is required, and for the Gentile, it's optional. So just like the other passages we looked at, God makes a clear distinction here between the native Israelites and the Gentiles. And even when they're both told to do the same thing, or that the same rules apply to both of them, God makes a point of distinguishing between the two people groups. And he goes on to say in the next verse, "For the assembly there shall be one statute for you and for the stranger who sojourns with you, the statute forever throughout your generations. You and the sojourner shall be alike before the Lord. One law and one rule shall be for you and for the stranger who sojourns with you." So the one law and one rule mentioned in this passage isn't a reference to the entirety of the law of Moses, but to the common rules for supplementary offerings in Israel. And again, even when bound by the same rules about sacrifice, the Torah maintains a distinction between the native Israelite and the stranger. I mean, the fact that Yahweh consistently refers to non-Israelites as foreigners and strangers and sojourners shows us that he didn't consider them to be Israel. In fact, let's drill down on that distinction a bit. Here's the thing. Babylonians, Assyrians, Egyptians, and all the other Gentiles were never commanded or expected to eat kosher, or keep Shabbat, or circumcise their men, or keep the Torah feasts. This wasn't required of Gentile nations, and we never see Gentiles judged or punished for not doing those things. The only people judged for that are the Israelites. Now, as we've just seen, when Gentiles lived or traveled with the Israelites, they were judged under the same civil laws and subject to the same punishment for crimes, which is no different than an American committing a crime in Italy and then being subject to the Italian punishment for that crime, right? And when it comes to participating in the rituals and the worship of Yahweh, such as the Passover meal or offerings and sacrifices at the tabernacle, Gentiles weren't required to do those things, but God did allow it. And I think this is one way that God began fulfilling his promise to Abraham to bless the nations through his descendants, which we read about in Genesis 12. Foreigners were allowed to join their ranks and worship the one true God. And it's a foreshadowing of when that promise will reach its final fulfillment as the nations put their faith in Jesus, Abraham's ultimate descendant. So the passage we looked at reveal that if a Gentile chose to participate in those things, Yahweh had some rules for them, right? So the Gentile in Israel wasn't subject to the Mosaic law in the same way the native Israelites were. And in some instances, they weren't subject to it at all. For example, there was a different dietary standard. In Deuteronomy 14, Yahweh commanded Israel, "You shall not eat anything that has died naturally. You may give it to the sojourner who's within your towns, that he may eat it, or you may sell it to a foreigner, for you are a people holy to the Lord your God." Now, this is the Torah telling us in no uncertain terms that Gentiles are allowed to eat things that Israelites are not. And the reason was holiness, which means set apartness. So God's saying, hey, Gentiles can eat that stuff, but I don't want my people, the Israelites, eating it, because they are to be set apart, to be different and distinct for me. Which is a really telling fact, actually. It tells us that the eating of certain things wasn't inherently immoral or wrong. The holy God had no problem with sojourners and foreigners eating it. The uncleanness of food that God talks about in the Torah is a ritual uncleanness, which is why the Israelites couldn't eat it, but the sojourners could. We also see differences between Israelites and foreigners in God's commands about loaning money. Every 7th year, the Israelites were commanded to release what they had lent to their fellow Israelites, but not what they had lent to the Gentiles. Deuteronomy 15 says, "And this is the manner of release. Every creditor shall release what he has lent to his neighbor. He shall not exact it of his neighbor, his brother, because the Lord's release has been proclaimed. Of a foreigner you may exact it, but whatever of yours is with your brother, your hand shall release." And Deuteronomy 23 reveals a similar command about charging interest on loans. You may charge a foreigner interest, but you may not charge your brother interest, that the Lord your God may bless you in all that you undertake in the land that you are entering to take possession of it. The Torah teaches a clear difference in the treatment of Israelites and Gentiles under the law of Moses. Israelites can require repayment and charge interest on loans made to Gentiles, but not so with their fellow Israelites. And that's because the law of Moses was given to Israel alone. Yes, God made accommodations for Gentiles who lived and traveled with Israel, but passages like the ones we've looked at today underscore the distinction between Israel and the other nations, and the fact that the Mosaic laws were for Israel rather than universal laws given to all people. Now, were there some universal laws included in the law of Moses? Of course. But the universal commands in the Mosaic law, those that deal with right and wrong and loving God, those all existed long before Mount Sinai. And we know that they were universal laws because we see God judging even Gentiles for things like murder and greed and sexual immorality and wickedness. Okay, let me close by sharing the perspective of a trio of Messianic Jewish scholars on this issue. And why is that helpful? Well, as ethnic Hebrew-speaking Jews who were born and raised in Israel and have come to faith in Jesus, these guys are keenly aware of the role that the Mosaic law played for the ancient people of Israel. So let me read a short passage from their book, Reading Moses, Seeing Jesus. Let's jump a few thousand years back to the time of the ancient Near East, a culture and mindset completely foreign to ours today, whose social structures are badly damaged by the fall. Within this context, God raises up a new nation with new laws to live by in order to create a new culture for them. In doing so, he adapts his expectations to a people whose attitudes and actions are subject to influence by the pagan nations around them. These laws aren't the permanent divine ideal for all peoples everywhere at all times. They are specific to that people with their specific needs in that ancient era. Take, for example, God's ideal for marriage, a monogamous union joining husband and wife as one flesh, Genesis 2:24. When God is dealing with Israel, a nation of fallen humans affected by their surroundings and the ancient Near East, God's ideals are distorted and forgotten. Therefore, God is on the move to restore his ideals through this small new nation. The laws of Moses are a first step in that process. And to close the loop on the idea here about God's ideal for marriage, they're referring to the words of Jesus in Matthew 19 when he answered the Pharisees saying, "Because of the hardness of your heart, Moses allowed you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it was not so." In other words, the law that Yahweh gave to Israel at Sinai, while it was holy and righteous and good, it didn't represent his ultimate ideal for all people at all times. And that's why the theology of Torahism is so dangerous. They're peddling the idea that followers of Jesus today need to return to the law that God gave to ancient Israel at that time and for that culture. Now, are God's commands holy and perfect? Absolutely. But not every command that God has given applies to every person at all times. Some of his commands were only given to certain people. For example, Adam and Noah and Abraham and Moses. They were all given commands that don't apply to everyone. And even the commands in the law of Moses itself don't apply to everyone. Some only apply to priests. Some only apply to women or men. And many of God's commands were intentionally temporary and only applied for certain times. For example, gathering manna in the wilderness, or Yahweh's commands to Israel while in Babylon to build houses and settle down and get married and increase in number there. These were holy commands, but they had an expiration date. We're each only expected to keep the commands of God that apply to us. And the law of Moses does not apply to followers of Jesus under the new covenant. So telling Christians today that they're obligated to eat kosher or keep the Torah feasts is like telling Moses that he's obligated to sacrifice his son on Mount Moriah. No, that was a command that God gave to Abraham alone for his time in his setting. It doesn't apply to Moses, right? Likewise, the ceremonial Mosaic commands don't apply to Christians today. That's why we don't have a Levitical priesthood, even though it's required in the law of Moses. The New Testament says that all believers are now priests. And it's why we don't have a temple, even though the Mosaic law requires a temple. The New Testament says that we believers are now God's temple. And it's why Hebrews 10 tells us that there is no longer any offering for sin, even though the law of Moses required blood sacrifices for sin. Yeshua was our sacrifice once for all. Thanks for watching. Shalom.